All right guys, so the purpose of this video is to show you guys pretty briefly how I'm going to be installing this FoxFloat X2 shock, and it's going to be going onto a Bronson V4, which is the mullet setup. So it's got the 29 front wheel and the 27.5 rear wheel. One thing to note, this is the 2022 model, and if you guys are familiar with this shock, you may have heard that there were some issues. I spoke to a technician today from Fox, and he assured me that only about 3% of these shocks that were manufactured in that year are having issues. The good thing, those guys are taking care of the customers, so if you do have an issue from the 2021 model and up, send it in for a service. The turnaround time is several weeks right now, but they will essentially either send you a brand new shock or ultimately build you out with the updated parts. All right guys, let's jump on over to the bike here and let's try to get this thing installed. All right guys, so in order to get this shock off of here, you're gonna have two bolts. One sits right here and one's gonna be right here, which is also where the flip chip is. I'm not gonna do anything with the flip chip, but you're gonna need a 6 millimeter Allen key. My understanding is that this is my first time doing this on this bike, so hopefully it should be pretty straightforward. Yeah, so this should be pretty easy. It might be a little pain to break loose, but and then I also have a torque wrench set up that I'm going to use to torque everything back, and I'll get the specs on that here shortly. I'm just going to leave that loose for now and leave it in there. Just because I know this stuff tends to want to slip up. This is going to be a little bit tighter in there, but try to be careful with your frame here. I've only had this bike for about 2.5, 3 weeks. So. Okay. All right, so I imagine this is all going to kind of collapse when I pull this out of here. I'm sure there's probably some... So hopefully that just stays like that. Also, just pay attention to the orientation of this hole. This is part of your flip chip, so you just want to make sure that it's oriented correctly. So I'll just try to keep it the same way it was. I'll just set that down. It's going to be kind of tight. And I'm realizing here, before you try to take this apart and take the lid for your little storage compartment out, make sure that's out of there. All right, well, that's pretty straightforward there. So I got this old one out. All right guys, so here's the new FoxFloat X2. I'm gonna go ahead and try to get this mounted in here. You will need to rotate this to make sure everything lines up appropriately. So I'll just get it pretty close for now. And there was some concern. Okay, it's running a little short here. I think it's because this canister needs to be pulled out. All right, guys, I'm gonna try to get this thing pumped up a little bit to get this stroke to come out a little bit further, because right now it's short and not everything's lining up. Give me a second. All right, so I got a little bit of air in here. I only got about 50 pounds. Let's see if we can get this in there. So everything's gonna line up. Seems like that's the way to do it. Okay. All right, so basically what's going on is If you look closely right there, you can see where the holes aren't quite lining up with that shock mount. So again, just remember the orientation of that lower flip chip there. All you got to do is basically just lift up on this back end here, and it should go ahead and start to line that up a little bit. So it might just take a little bit of finagling. There we go. Now she slid in. So this flip chip will stay in the low position. That's how it came, I believe. So I think all there is to do now is to get this thing tightened back down. One thing to note, I just figured out on the back side of this here, there's a wing nut sort of thing that slips inside the other side of the link, and that's how you can thread this bolt back in. So make sure that stays in there and make sure you orient it correctly, because what I did is mine actually fell out. I heard something tinkering around earlier, and that's what it was. So anyways, we're back to where we were, just trying to get this thing lined up. And should be good to go now here. It's kind of tedious, guys. I've never done this before again, so it's just kind of a learning process here. And just make sure everything's lined up. Ah, that thing fell out again, so that's what that chinging noise is. All right, I'm gonna get it back in there. All right, guys, I'm back. And I'm gonna tell you, probably got a few tips and tricks, but that's pretty tedious work right there. Definitely want to make sure that little wing nut stays in place. It's kind of hard because it is loose. Make sure you have something underneath your bike. If it does fall out, you're not going to lose that. Ultimately, we got her going, so I'm going to go ahead and get this snugged up, and should be about all we got to do. So according to the Santa Cruz Bronson, the tech sheet on their website, we want to torque these shock bolts to 20 Newton meters. Did I say that right? Newton meters? There's one, so I had it pretty close already. Yeah, guys, there's not a lot of space to work in here with this stuff, so. A couple things that I'm going to mention. With this whole door here to the cockpit storage compartment, I do see there being an issue with the piggyback and the low high-speed compression, all the adjustment dials not being accessible when this goes back on there. It's a pretty tight fit, so I'm probably gonna have to remove that bottle cage and figure out something else. Santa Cruz did say that this flock is compatible with it, but I'm not convinced right now with this specific bottle cage that that's gonna work. The mounting hardware is already predetermined on this little latch, so I'm not sure what else I can really do about that. So I'm gonna have to figure something out there. I might just have to go without the bottle, which kind of sucks, but I have to look into that a little bit. Other than that, guys, I got the shock on there. I did let all the air out of the shock and compressed it all the way out to make sure that there was nothing going to be interfering with the frame. And now I'm in the process of going and getting it pumped back up. They say to equalize the two chambers every 50 psi or so. It's about 50 there, and you're just going to kind of cycle it a little bit. Very slow rebound. It's also because there's probably just low pressure in there right now. Pumping and. Okay, so that's about 100 right there. That was making some awful weird noise. All right, guys, so that's pretty much going to wrap up the installation portion of this video. I went ahead and got my shock set up with the appropriate pressure needed for the 30% sag that I'm looking for. The Bronson V4 has 160 millimeter of travel, And to get that 30% sag for a 160-pound rider, you're gonna need right around 150 PSI of pressure in this shock. Now that's gonna vary depending on your weight, so just refer to Fox's online. They usually you can find it in a pamphlet that comes with the shock, but it'll give you a good idea of where the rider weight in comparison is to the actual shock size. I'm not going to go into too many details on how that is all set up because there's so many videos out there that already explain that, but that's just basically what I'm set up with here on this particular bike. I also want to mention that there are 2 volume spacers that I installed before I put this shock on. That's a pretty easy process as well, and I might do a video later on to show you guys how that process works. A couple notes and tips that I want to throw your all's way. One, you're most likely going to need to remove this bottle cage here. It did interfere with the top portion of this shock, so that's kind of a bummer, and there might be a workaround for it out there that's already been fixed, but if not, I might just have to come up with my own little thing to make that work. Other than that, the installation itself is pretty simple. You're only going to need a couple Allen keys. My one tip for putting this hardware back in from the lower link where your shock mount bolts, there is a wing nut on the back side of this lower portion here. Just make sure you keep track of that, because when I went to go put my bolt back in, it actually popped it out, and it's a pain in the butt to try to get that all back in there. There's not a lot of room to work around back here. I would honestly recommend taking your back tire off as well if you can. It might alleviate a little bit of that cramped space in there. Guys, I think that's really going to be it for me today. I really appreciate your time. If you guys enjoyed this video, do all the YouTube things, like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and keep an eye open for that next video. We'll see you guys next time.